The Arctic night stretched endlessly, a frozen wilderness where silence carried more weight than sound. John Miller, a U.S. Army guard, tightened his parka as the military convoy pushed through the blizzard. He had been reassigned to Alaska under strict orders, guard duty at a government laboratory buried beneath the ice. On paper, it was routine. In reality, nothing about this mission felt ordinary. The journey itself was unsettling. For hours, the convoy crawled across snow-covered plains, headlights swallowed by the storm. Radio silence was mandatory. No chatter, no music, no contact with the outside world. The soldiers sat stiffly, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the snow as if they feared what might be hiding beneath it. John felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him, the sense that they were being swallowed by the land itself. When the trucks finally stopped, John stepped out into a world of unnatural quiet. The facility loomed ahead, half buried in ice, its steel doors marked with faded government insignia. Floodlights cut through the storm, but even they seemed powerless against the darkness. The air was heavy, unnatural, as though the land itself resented their presence. A guard at the gate checked his papers without a word, then motioned him inside. The entrance was narrow, descending into the earth like a scar carved into frozen ground. As John walked down the steel steps, the sound of his boots echoed too loudly, bouncing off walls that seemed to close in around him. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The hum of generators filled the air, but beneath it was something else, an almost imperceptible vibration, as if the facility itself was alive. The corridors were lined with reinforced doors, each marked with warning signs: biohazard, restricted access, authorized personnel only. The deeper he went, the colder it became, despite the heaters humming along the walls. Colonel Davis greeted him with a curt nod. "Welcome to the lab," he said, his voice clipped, his eyes sharp. "Your orders are simple. Guard the perimeter, follow instructions, and do not ask questions." John wanted to ask anyway. Why was a government lab hidden here, in the most desolate corner of Alaska? Why the secrecy, the silence, the rules? But the colonel's tone left no room for curiosity. As he was led to his post, John noticed the scientists moving through the corridors. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, their movements hurried. They avoided eye contact, clutching notebooks and tablets as if their lives depended on them. One scientist muttered something under his breath, a phrase John couldn't catch, before disappearing behind a sealed door. Then came the first sign. As John stood at his station, he realized the silence outside wasn't natural. The wind had stopped. The snow no longer fell. The Arctic night was utterly still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. John Miller tightened his grip on his rifle. Something was wrong here. Something was waiting. The steel doors closed behind John Miller with a heavy thud, sealing him inside the labyrinth of the government laboratory. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, as if the walls themselves were draining warmth from his body. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to make the shadows dance across the reinforced panels. Every corridor carried the same warning signs: biohazard, restricted access, authorized personnel only. It was clear this place was built to contain something, not to study it. John's boots echoed against the metal floor as he followed Colonel Davis deeper into the facility. The colonel's silence was unnerving, his eyes fixed forward, his jaw tight. They passed sealed doors with multiple locks, each one marked with symbols John didn't recognize. Behind one door, a faint scratching sound pulsed rhythmically, like claws against steel. John slowed instinctively, but Davis barked, "Keep moving." Scientists hurried past them, clutching notebooks and tablets, their faces pale and drawn. They avoided eye contact, whispering in fragments that carried just enough meaning to unsettle him. Containment breach, mutation, protocol failure. Their movements were frantic, as though they were racing against time. John noticed how none of them lingered near the larger doors. They walked quickly, almost fearfully, as if something inside those chambers was aware of them. Dr. Emily Carter appeared suddenly, her lab coat stained with ink and her hands trembling. She glanced at John, then at Davis, before speaking in a hushed tone. "It's stronger now," she said. "We can't hold it much longer." Davis silenced her with a glare, but the words lodged in John's mind like a splinter. Stronger? Hold it? What exactly was this lab keeping locked away? One chamber drew John's attention more than the rest. It was massive, reinforced with layers of steel and marked with a symbol unlike any he had seen before. The air around it felt heavier, charged with something unseen. As he passed, he thought he heard a voice, soft, almost human, calling his name. He froze, his pulse quickening, but Davis grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "Never stop near that door," the colonel warned. "Never listen." The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The hum of machinery grew louder, but beneath it was a vibration that seemed to resonate in John's bones. The lights flickered more often, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. He felt as though the facility itself was alive, breathing, waiting. Finally, Davis stopped at a control room. "This is where you'll stand guard," he said. "Your job is simple. Watch, listen, and obey the rules. Do not open doors. Do not respond to voices. Do not break protocol." His tone left no room for argument, but John's unease only deepened. As he settled into his post, John realized the truth. This wasn't a laboratory. It was a prison, and whatever was locked inside was desperate to get out. Colonel Davis stood in the control room, his posture rigid, his voice sharp enough to slice through the heavy silence. The soldiers gathered around him, their faces tense, their eyes betraying the unease that had already begun to spread through the facility. John Miller stood among them, gripping his rifle, waiting for instructions that would define the boundaries of his duty. The colonel's words were deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of authority. "There are rules here," he began. "Rules you will follow without question. Break them and you won't live long enough to regret it." His tone left no room for doubt. He gestured toward a list posted on the wall, etched in bold letters. "Do not open sealed doors. Do not respond to voices. Do not break protocol." At first glance, the rules seemed absurdly simple, but the way the colonel spoke made them feel like commandments carved into stone. John studied the list, his mind racing. Why would soldiers need to be warned against responding to voices? Why emphasize sealed doors? The questions burned inside him, but he knew better than to ask. Dr. Dupree, Emily Carter entered the room, her face pale, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. She added to the colonel's warning. "These rules are not for your discipline," she said softly. "They are for your survival." Her tone carried a weight that silenced even the most hardened soldiers. John felt the tension rise. The scientists avoided the soldiers' gaze, whispering among themselves. One muttered, "It's stronger now," before quickly retreating down the corridor. The colonel ignored the comment, but John caught it, and the words lodged in his mind like a splinter. The colonel continued, "You will hear things, voices. They will sound familiar. They will call your name. You will want to answer. Do not. If you respond, you will not return." His eyes scanned the room, locking on to each soldier as if daring them to disobey. John's pulse quickened. He had faced combat before, but this was different. This wasn't about enemies he could see or fight. This was about something unseen, something that bent reality itself. The colonel ended the briefing with a final warning. This lab exists to contain what should never have been found. Your job is not to understand it. Your job is to survive it. As the soldiers dispersed, John lingered near the posted rules. The words seemed to pulse, alive with meaning. He thought of the scratching he had heard earlier, the pale faces of the scientists, the way the air itself seemed to vibrate. The rules weren't just orders, they were barriers against something waiting to break free. John tightened his grip on his rifle. He had been sent here to guard, but now he realized he was guarding against something far worse than an intruder. He was guarding against the unknown. John Miller's first night on duty was marked by a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. The Arctic winds had died down, leaving only the hum of generators and the occasional flicker of fluorescent lights. He stood at his post, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the corridor. At first, it seemed uneventful, until the voices began. It started faintly, like a whisper carried through the ventilation shafts. At first, John thought it was one of the scientists, perhaps muttering to themselves. But the words grew clearer, sharper, and unmistakably directed at him. "John." The sound was soft, almost familiar, as though spoken by someone he knew. His pulse quickened. He turned toward the sealed chamber, the one reinforced with multiple locks, and the whisper came again. "John, help me." He froze, remembering Colonel Davis's warning, "Do not respond to voices." The rule echoed in his mind, but curiosity gnawed at him. The voice was human, pleading, desperate. Could someone be trapped inside? He tightened his grip on his rifle, forcing himself to stay silent. Dr. Emily Carter appeared suddenly, her face pale, her eyes wide with urgency. "Never look directly into the observation windows," she whispered, "no matter what you hear." Her words carried a weight that chilled him more than the Arctic air. She glanced nervously at the sealed chamber, then hurried away, leaving John with the echo of her warning. The voices grew bolder as the night wore on. Sometimes they sounded like soldiers he had served with, calling his name in familiar tones. Other times they were distorted, inhuman, layered with static that made his skin crawl. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, vibrating in his bones, filling the air with dread. John tried to distract himself, focusing on the posted rules, but the voices pressed harder. "Open the door," they urged. "We're cold. We're dying. You can save us." Each plea was more convincing than the last, designed to break his resolve. He clenched his jaw, refusing to answer, but the temptation was unbearable. At one point, he thought he heard his mother's voice, soft and gentle, calling him by name. His heart lurched, his mind screaming that it was impossible. She was thousands of miles away, safe in the United States. Yet the sound was so real, so intimate, that he nearly stepped forward. Only the colonel's warning kept him rooted in place. The scientists moved quickly through the corridors, avoiding the chamber entirely. Their faces betrayed fear. Their whispers carried fragments of truth. "It's learning," one muttered. "It knows their names." John caught the words, and dread settled deeper in his chest. By dawn, John realized the voices weren't random. They were deliberate, targeted, and intelligent. They knew who he was. They knew how to break him. And if he faltered, if he answered even once, the sealed doors would no longer hold. The night had settled into a rhythm of silence, broken only by the hum of generators and the occasional flicker of lights. John Miller stood at his post, his rifle steady, his mind replaying the warnings he had been given. The voices had grown quieter, but their absence felt more dangerous than their presence. It was as if they were waiting. Then, without warning, the lights died. The facility plunged into darkness. The hum of machinery silenced in an instant. The air grew heavy, pressing down on John's chest. Emergency sirens wailed, their shrill cry echoing through the corridors. Red lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows that twisted across the walls. John's instincts screamed at him to stay alert. He tightened his grip on his rifle, scanning the corridor. Somewhere in the distance, metal groaned, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door unlocking. His pulse quickened. The rules had been clear. Do not open sealed doors. But someone or something had ignored them. Scientists rushed past him, panic etched into their faces. One shouted, "Containment breach," before disappearing into the darkness. Another stumbled, dropping a notebook filled with frantic scribbles. John picked it up briefly, catching a glimpse of words that chilled him. "It's out. It's learning. It knows." He dropped the notebook, his breath shallow. The scratching sound he had heard before was louder now, sharper, echoing through the corridors. It was no longer confined to a single chamber. It was moving. John backed against the wall, his eyes darting toward the sealed doors. One of them rattled violently, the lock straining against unseen force. He remembered Emily Carter's warning, never look directly into the observation windows. But curiosity tugged at him, and for a moment he glanced. What he saw was not human. A shadow moved within, its form shifting, its edges blurred as though reality itself struggled to contain it. Eyes, too many eyes, glowed faintly in the darkness, locking onto his. John staggered back, his heart pounding, his mind screaming to look away. Suddenly, the door burst open. A rush of cold air swept through the corridor, carrying with it a sound that was neither human nor animal. Soldiers shouted, their voices drowned by the chaos. Gunfire erupted, but the bullets seemed to vanish into the shadows. One by one, the soldiers fell silent, their screams cut short. John turned and ran, his boots pounding against the metal floor. The sirens wailed louder, the red lights flashing in frantic rhythm. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew closer, scratching, dragging, voices calling his name. He pushed through the corridors, desperate to escape, but every turn seemed to lead him deeper into the labyrinth. As he rounded a corner, he collided with Emily Carter. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "It's out," she gasped. "We can't stop it now." Her words confirmed what John already knew. The lab had failed. The rules had been broken, and whatever had been contained was free. The blackout had left the facility trembling with fear, but what came next shattered any illusion of control. John Miller stood frozen in the corridor, his rifle raised, his breath shallow. The sirens wailed, red lights flickered, and the scratching sound grew louder, closer, more deliberate. Then, without warning, the first attack began. A soldier stationed near the sealed chamber screamed. His voice echoed through the halls, sharp and desperate, before being cut short. John turned, catching only a glimpse of movement, something dark, shifting, faster than his eyes could follow. The soldier was gone, his rifle clattering to the floor. No body remained, only silence. Panic erupted. Soldiers fired into the shadows, bullets ricocheting off steel walls, but the enemy was unseen. The air itself seemed to bend, shapes flickering in and out of existence. John caught sight of a figure, tall, distorted, its limbs too long, its movements unnatural. It darted across the corridor, vanishing into the darkness before anyone could aim. Another scream tore through the chaos. A second soldier disappeared, dragged into the shadows by something unseen. The sound of claws against metal reverberated, followed by a chilling silence. John's heart pounded, his instincts screaming that this was not a fight they could win. Dr. Emily Carter rushed into the corridor, her face pale, her voice trembling. "It's adapting," she cried. "It knows how to move between us. It's not just escaping, it's hunting." Her words sent a wave of dread through the soldiers. This wasn't a random breach. It was deliberate, calculated. John fired into the darkness, his rifle echoing through the hall. For a moment, he thought he saw eyes, glowing faintly, too many to belong to a single creature. The bullet struck, but the figure dissolved into shadow, reforming elsewhere. It was as if reality itself bent to its will. Colonel Davis barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Hold your positions! Do not break formation!" But fear had already taken hold. Soldiers stumbled, firing wildly, retreating into side corridors. The rules had been broken, and now the lab was no longer a prison. It was a hunting ground. John's mind raced. The voices had been warnings, bait designed to weaken their resolve. Now the creature was free, and it was using everything it had learned. It knew their names, it knew their fear, and it was striking with precision. As the attack spread, John realized the truth. The lab had never been about research. It was containment, a desperate attempt to cage something that should never have been found. And now, with the first attack, the cage was broken. The corridor fell silent once more, but the silence was worse than the screams. Soldiers were gone, erased as if they had never existed. Their names would vanish, their families would forget, and reality itself would bend to the creature's will. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his breath ragged. The first attack was over, but it was only the beginning. The chaos of the first attack left the facility trembling. Soldiers were missing, erased as if they had never existed. The corridors echoed with silence, broken only by the faint hum of failing generators. John Miller stood among the wreckage, his rifle heavy in his hands, his mind racing. The rules had been broken, and now the lab was no longer a prison. It was a battlefield. Hours later, a new figure arrived at the facility. Agent Ramirez, a federal investigator from Washington, stepped through the steel doors with a grim expression. His presence carried authority, but his eyes betrayed unease. He was not here to reassure anyone. He was here to uncover the truth. Colonel Davis greeted him stiffly, his jaw tight. "We've had a containment breach," Davis admitted, We're holding it as best we can." Ramirez's gaze swept the corridor, lingering on the sealed chambers, the flickering lights, the soldiers' pale faces. "This lab was never supposed to exist," he said quietly, almost to himself. John overheard the words, and they struck him like a blow. Never supposed to exist? What did that mean? He wanted to ask, but Ramirez's tone left no room for interruption. The agent pulled out a folder, thick with classified documents, and spread them across a table in the control room. Photographs of experiments, reports stamped top secret, and handwritten notes filled the pages. Emily Carter joined them, her face pale, her hands trembling. She pointed to one of the photographs, a distorted figure, blurred as though the camera itself had struggled to capture it. "That's what we were studying," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to survive, but it did, and now it's stronger." Ramirez's jaw tightened. "This isn't research," he said. "This is containment. The government buried this lab here because it was the only place remote enough to hide it. But hiding doesn't mean control, and now it's out." John felt the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He had been sent here to guard, but he hadn't been told the truth. He wasn't protecting a lab. He was guarding a secret so dangerous it threatened reality itself. The investigation deepened as Ramirez questioned the scientists. Their answers were fragmented, evasive, filled with fear. One admitted that the creature had been communicating for weeks, learning names, mimicking voices. Another confessed that the rules were not just protocol, they were survival mechanisms discovered through trial and error. Every broken rule had cost lives. Ramirez turned to John. "You've heard the voices, haven't you?" John nodded reluctantly. "Then you know. It's not just inside the lab anymore. It's reaching out. And if it spreads beyond these walls, Anchorage, Washington, maybe the entire country will forget what it means to be human." The words chilled John to his core. The investigation had revealed the truth. The lab was never about science. It was about survival. And now, survival was slipping through their fingers. The facility was no longer a place of science. It had become a battlefield of chaos. After the first attack, the soldiers who remained were shaken, their discipline unraveling with every passing minute. The corridors echoed with panic, shouts, gunfire, and the pounding of boots as men and women scrambled for safety. The rules that had once been carved into stone were forgotten, replaced by raw survival instincts. John Miller watched as formations dissolved. Soldiers abandoned their posts, retreating into side corridors, firing blindly into shadows that seemed to move faster than their bullets. Colonel Davis barked orders, his voice hoarse from shouting, but his authority no longer carried weight. Fear had taken hold, and fear was stronger than command. The scientists were no better. Emily Carter tried to rally her colleagues, but most fled, clutching notebooks and tablets as if knowledge could shield them from what stalked the halls. One scientist collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably, whispering, "It's everywhere. It's in the walls. It's in us." His words spread like infection, fueling the panic. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They called names, whispered promises, mocked the soldiers' fear. Some voices sounded like loved ones, others like fallen comrades. One soldier broke down, screaming his mother's name before running toward a sealed chamber. He never returned. The rules had been broken again, and the consequences were immediate. John tried to hold his ground, his rifle steady, but the chaos pressed in from all sides. He saw Ramirez in the control room, his face grim as he sifted through classified files. "This isn't containment anymore," Ramirez muttered. "This is collapse." His words carried the weight of truth. The lab had failed. Colonel Davis attempted one last stand, rallying a group of soldiers near the main corridor. "Hold the line," he shouted, but the line broke almost instantly. Shadows darted through the ranks. Soldiers vanished mid-stride, their screams cut short. Rifles clattered to the floor, their owners erased as if they had never existed. John's mind raced. The rules had been designed to prevent this exact moment, but fear had undone them. The voices had manipulated, the shadows had hunted, and now order itself was gone. He realized the facility wasn't just collapsing physically, it was collapsing psychologically. Reality was bending, and no one could hold it together. Emily Carter grabbed John's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to get out," she pleaded. "There's no stopping it now." Her words echoed the truth he already knew. The lab was no longer a prison. It was a feeding ground. As alarms blared and lights flickered, John saw the inevitable. Soldiers scattering, scientists fleeing, the colonel shouting into the void. The creature had won its first battle, not through brute force, but through fear. Order had collapsed, and with it, the last fragile barrier between containment and chaos. The aftermath of the collapse was worse than the attack itself. Soldiers and scientists had vanished, but what unsettled John Miller most was not their absence. It was the way reality itself seemed to deny they had ever existed. At first, John thought it was shock. He remembered Private Harris screaming as the shadows dragged him away. He remembered the clatter of Harris's rifle hitting the floor. But when he tried to speak his name aloud, the others looked at him blankly. "Who?" one soldier asked. "We don't have anyone by that name." John's blood ran cold. Harris had been real. He had fought beside him. Yet now, his existence was erased, not just physically, but from memory, from records, from reality itself. The bunk where Harris had slept was empty, his belongings gone, his name scrubbed from the roster. It was as if he had never been born. The phenomenon spread quickly. Families outside the lab began to forget their loved ones. Ramirez showed John a classified report from Washington. Photographs of missing personnel had blurred, names had vanished from databases, and families insisted they had no recollection of the people who had disappeared. "It's rewriting reality," Ramirez said grimly. "Every time it takes someone, the world forgets they ever existed." Emily Carter explained in hushed tones that this was the true danger. "It doesn't kill," she whispered. "It erases. It consumes memory, identity, history. That's why the rules exist. They're not just about survival. They're about keeping reality intact." John struggled to comprehend the scale of it. If the creature could erase individuals, what stopped it from erasing entire groups, entire cities? Already, Anchorage reported anomalies. Families forgetting neighbors, schools missing students, businesses losing employees whose names no longer appeared in records. The government scrambled to contain the spread, but how do you fight something that rewrites existence itself? The voices grew stronger, more manipulative. They didn't just call names now, they offered promises. "You don't need to remember them," they whispered. "Forget, and you'll be safe. Forget, and you'll belong to us." The temptation was insidious, gnawing at the edges of sanity. John clung to his memories, repeating names in his head like prayers. Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez. He forced himself to remember, even as the world tried to erase them. But he knew it was a losing battle. The creature was stronger, and reality itself was bending under its influence. Colonel Davis, once a pillar of authority, began to falter. He barked orders, but his words carried less weight as soldiers forgot who he was. Some stared at him blankly, as if he had never existed. John realized with horror that even leaders could be erased, leaving nothing behind. The lab was no longer just a battlefield. It was a fracture in reality, a place where existence itself unraveled. And John understood the terrifying truth. Survival was no longer about staying alive. It was about refusing to be forgotten. The facility was collapsing into chaos, but amid the panic, John Miller noticed something strange. A notebook lay on the floor, its pages filled with frantic handwriting. The words were scrawled in ink, shaky and uneven, as though written in desperation. At the bottom of the page, one sentence stood out, etched deeper than the rest. The last rule cannot be broken. John picked up the notebook, his hands trembling. He scanned the pages, finding fragments of warnings. Do not open sealed doors. Do not respond to voices. Do not break protocol. These were the rules he already knew, but this final line was different. It carried a weight that felt heavier, more absolute. The last rule was not explained. It was simply declared. Emily Carter appeared beside him, her face pale, her voice hushed. "That rule," she whispered, "is the one we don't speak of. It's the rule that keeps reality intact." Her eyes darted nervously toward the sealed chamber, the one reinforced with multiple locks. If it's broken, there's no coming back. John's pulse quickened. "What does it mean?" he asked, but Emily shook her head. "You'll know when it happens, and when it does, it will already be too late." The voices grew louder, more insistent. They called his name, pleaded for help, mocked his silence. One voice sounded like his father, another like a fallen comrade. Each one was designed to break him, to lure him into responding. John clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay silent, but the temptation gnawed at him. Ramirez entered the corridor, his face grim. He had been studying the classified files, piecing together fragments of truth. "The last rule," he said quietly, "is the one they never wrote down in detail. It's the rule that keeps the creature from rewriting everything. If it's broken, the erasures won't stop. Families, cities, nations, they'll vanish, erased from existence, and no one will remember they were ever here." The weight of his words pressed down on John like ice. The rules had been designed to protect them, but this final rule was different. It wasn't about survival, it was about preserving reality itself. Colonel Davis barked orders, trying to restore order, but his voice carried less authority now. Soldiers looked at him blankly, some forgetting who he was. John realized with horror that even Davis was beginning to fade, his existence slipping away. The last rule was already under threat. Emily clutched John's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Whatever happens, don't break it," she pleaded. "If you do, none of this will matter. None of us will matter." John tightened his grip on his rifle, his mind racing. The last rule was a mystery, but its importance was undeniable. He didn't know what it demanded, But he knew one thing. If it was broken, the world itself would unravel. The notebook trembled in his hands, the words etched deeper, darker, as though alive. The last rule cannot be broken. The chaos of the breach had left the facility trembling, but as dawn approached, something even more unsettling happened. The silence returned. Not the ordinary quiet of the Arctic, but a frozen, suffocating stillness that pressed against the walls and seeped into the bones of everyone inside. John Miller stood at his post, his rifle heavy in his hands, his breath fogging in the cold air. The screams, the gunfire, the chaos, all of it had stopped. The corridors were empty, the soldiers scattered, the scientists hiding. Yet the silence was not comforting. It was oppressive, unnatural, as though the world itself had paused. Outside, the storm had vanished. No wind, no snow, no sound. The Arctic night was frozen in place, the sky a black canvas untouched by movement. Floodlights illuminated the snow, but nothing stirred. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. Inside, the silence was worse. The hum of generators had faded, the flicker of light slowed, and even the vibrations John had felt beneath the floor were gone. The facility was dead, yet alive in its stillness. Every sound he made, his boots against the metal, the click of his rifle, echoed too loudly, breaking the fragile quiet. Emily Carter emerged from a side corridor, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Do you feel it?" she whispered. John nodded. "It's not gone," she continued. "It's waiting." Her words carried the weight of truth. The silence was not absence, it was anticipation. Ramirez joined them, his expression grim. He held a classified file in his hand, its pages trembling slightly. "This is what happens after a breach," he explained. "It retreats, but not because it's defeated. It retreats because it's preparing." His voice was low, deliberate, as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile balance. John's instinct screamed at him. The silence was not safety, it was a trap. The creature had withdrawn, but its presence lingered, pressing against reality itself. He felt it in the air, in the walls, in his own thoughts. The voices were gone, but their absence was louder than their presence. Colonel Davis tried to rally the soldiers, but his words fell flat. Some stared at him blankly, forgetting who he was. Others simply ignored him, lost in the oppressive quiet. Order had collapsed, and now even memory was slipping away. John tightened his grip on his rifle, scanning the corridor. He knew the silence would not last. It was the calm before something worse, something larger. The creature was not gone, it was gathering strength. Emily's voice broke the stillness once more. "This is the frozen silence," she said. "It means the next phase has begun." John's heart pounded. The silence was not peace. It was the herald of something far more terrifying. And when it ended, the lab, and perhaps the world, would never be the same. The frozen silence did not last. As the hours passed, John Miller began to notice movement. Shadows flickering along the walls, stretching unnaturally across the steel corridors. At first, he thought it was a trick of the failing lights, but soon he realized the shadows were not bound by the lamps. They moved independently, bending and twisting as though alive. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his breath shallow. The rules echoed in his mind. Do not respond to voices. Do not open sealed doors. Do not break protocol. Yet none of those rules spoke of shadows. These were something new, something the scientists had not warned him about. Emily Carter appeared at his side, her face pale, her voice trembling. "It's spreading," she whispered. The silence was only the beginning. Now it's moving through the corridors. Her eyes darted nervously toward the walls, where the shadows seemed to pulse, stretching closer. Ramirez joined them, his expression grim. He carried a flashlight, but when he shone it down the corridor, the beam bent unnaturally, swallowed by the darkness. "Light doesn't matter anymore," he muttered. "It's not shadows, it's presence. It's here with us." The soldiers were restless. Some fired into the darkness, their bullets vanishing as though absorbed. Others backed away, their eyes wide with terror. One soldier swore he saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, a tall, distorted silhouette with too many limbs. But when they advanced, the figure dissolved into shadow, leaving only silence behind. John's instincts screamed at him. The shadows were not random, they were deliberate, moving with purpose, circling them like predators. He felt their gaze, though they had no eyes. He heard whispers, though no mouths spoke. The corridors had become hunting grounds, and they were the prey. Colonel Davis tried to rally his men, barking orders, but his voice carried less authority now. The soldiers were breaking, their discipline unraveling. One stumbled forward, shouting into the darkness, demanding answers. The shadows swallowed him whole. His scream echoed briefly, then faded, erased as though he had never existed. Emily clutched John's arm, her voice urgent. "Don't look too long," she warned. "If you stare at them, they'll take you. That's how it begins." Her words chilled him, but he forced himself to obey. He kept his gaze moving, never lingering, never focusing. The corridors grew colder, the air heavier. The shadows pressed closer, filling every corner, every doorway. John realized the facility was no longer theirs. It belonged to the presence that moved within the dark. As the soldiers retreated, John stood his ground, his rifle steady. He knew the shadows were testing them, probing their fear, waiting for weakness. And he knew one thing with certainty: this was only the beginning. The corridors were no longer safe. They were alive. John Miller had begun to suspect that the scientists knew far more than they admitted. Their pale faces, their hurried whispers, their refusal to meet his eyes, it all pointed to secrets buried deeper than the sealed chambers. That suspicion became certainty when Emily Carter pressed a worn notebook into his hands. "This is what they won't tell you," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but her eyes carried determination. "Read it, but don't let anyone see you." John opened the notebook cautiously. The pages were filled with frantic handwriting, diagrams, and symbols he didn't recognize. Some entries were dated years earlier, long before he had even joined the army. The notes described experiments conducted in secrecy, attempts to communicate with something beyond human understanding. Words like phase shift, erasure, and identity collapse appeared repeatedly, underlined with urgency. One passage chilled him. "It does not kill, it rewrites." Subjects vanish not only physically, but from memory, history, and record. Families forget. Nations forget. Reality forgets. John's pulse quickened as he realized the scientists had known all along. The rules weren't just protocol, they were desperate measures to slow the inevitable. Another entry described voices. It learns names. It mimics loved ones. It tempts with familiarity. Responding is surrender. John remembered the whispers he had heard, the way they had sounded like his father, his comrades, even his mother. The notes confirmed his worst fear. The voices were not random, they were weapons. Emily pointed to a diagram showing concentric circles, each labeled with phases of containment. The final circle was marked Phase Omega. Beneath it, a single line was written in bold ink. If Phase Omega begins, reality collapse is irreversible. John's breath caught. "Has it started?" he asked. Emily's silence was answer enough. Ramirez entered the room, his eyes narrowing as he saw the notebook. "So you found it," he muttered. He explained that the government had buried the lab in Alaska because it was the only place remote enough to hide the truth. "This isn't research," Ramirez said. "It's damage control. They've been trying to contain something that doesn't belong in our world." John flipped through more pages, finding references to erased personnel. Names crossed out, photographs blurred, entire files missing. The scientists had documented every disappearance, but the records themselves were unstable. Ink fading, paper deteriorating, as though reality itself was erasing the evidence. The final pages carried warnings written in frantic strokes. "Do not break the last rule. Do not forget the names. Do not let silence win." John felt the weight of those words pressing down on him. The scientists had fought a losing battle, documenting truths that the world itself was trying to erase. Emily's voice broke the silence. "We're not just guarding a lab," she said. "We're guarding reality. And if we fail, there will be nothing left to remember." John closed the notebook, his hands trembling. The secrets were out, and they were worse than he had imagined. The scientists hadn't just discovered something, they had unleashed it. And now, the notes were the only fragile thread holding the truth together. The facility had descended into chaos, but amid the fear and erasure, a fragile spark of defiance began to form. John Miller realized that survival would not come from following orders alone, it would come from fighting back. The soldiers were scattered, the scientists terrified, but a few still clung to hope. Together, they began to form what would later be called the Resistance. It started with Emily Carter. Her pale face carried exhaustion, but her eyes burned with determination. She gathered a small group of scientists who had not fled, clutching their notebooks filled with warnings and data. "We can't run," she said firmly. "If we run, it spreads. If we fight, maybe we can hold it here." Her words carried conviction, and for the first time, John saw courage in her voice. Ramirez joined them, his federal authority giving weight to the plan. He laid out classified files, pointing to diagrams of containment protocols. "This isn't just a creature," he explained. "It's rewriting reality. If it escapes beyond these walls, the United States itself will forget. Families, cities, entire histories will vanish. We have to resist, even if it costs us everything." Colonel Davis, though shaken, agreed. His voice was hoarse, his authority weakened, but he still carried the discipline of command. "We hold the corridors," he ordered. "We keep the rules intact, and we fight until the last man." John felt the weight of their resolve pressing down on him. He had been sent here to guard, but now he was part of something larger. This was no longer about orders. It was about survival, about protecting reality itself. He tightened his grip on his rifle, ready to stand with them. The resistance formed quickly. Soldiers reinforced barricades, scientists rewired generators to restore partial power, and Ramirez coordinated patrols through the corridors. Emily distributed copies of her notes, urging everyone to memorize the rules. "If you forget," she warned, "you'll vanish. Remember the names. Remember the rules." The shadows pressed closer, testing their defenses. Voices whisper through the walls, mocking their efforts, tempting them to break. But the resistance held firm. They moved as one, refusing to respond, refusing to falter. For the first time since the breach, there was unity. John stood guard at the main corridor, his rifle steady, his mind focused. He repeated names in his head: Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had been erased. He knew memory was their weapon, the only thing that kept them anchored to reality. Emily approached him, her voice low. "We may not win," she admitted. "But if we resist, if we hold the line, maybe we can buy time. Maybe we can keep it contained." John nodded, his resolve hardening. The resistance had formed, fragile but determined. They were no longer just soldiers and scientists, they were guardians of reality. And though the shadows pressed closer, though the voices grew louder, they stood together. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, John felt hope. The fragile unity of the resistance did not last long. Fear has a way of breaking even the strongest bonds, and in the frozen corridors of the lab, fear was everywhere. John Miller sensed it in the way soldiers avoided each other's eyes, in the way scientists clutched their notebooks as if they were shields. It was only a matter of time before someone broke. That someone was Sergeant Daniels. He had been part of the resistance from the beginning, standing shoulder to shoulder with John during the blackout. But now his face was pale, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. The voices had found him. They whispered his name, mimicked his wife's voice, his daughter's laughter. They promised safety, escape, reunion. Daniels resisted at first, but the temptation grew too strong. John noticed the change. Daniels began lingering near the sealed chamber, staring too long at the observation windows. His lips moved silently, as though answering questions no one else could hear. John confronted him one night, gripping his rifle tightly. "You know the rules," he warned. "Don't respond. Don't look." Daniels flinched, but his eyes carried a desperate plea. "What if they're real?" he whispered. "What if someone's trapped inside?" Emily Carter overheard, her voice sharp with fear. "That's not your family. That's not anyone. It's bait. If you answer, you'll vanish." But Daniel shook his head, his resolve crumbling. "I can't ignore them anymore." The betrayal came swiftly. During a patrol, Daniels broke formation and approached the chamber. The voices grew louder, filling the corridor, calling his name with unbearable clarity. He pressed his hand against the steel door, whispering, "I'm here." The response was immediate. The door rattled violently, the lock straining against unseen force. Shadows surged through the corridor, swallowing the light. Soldiers shouted, firing into the darkness, but Daniels was already gone. His scream echoed briefly, then faded, erased as though he had never existed. His name vanished from the roster, his bunk emptied, his memory scrubbed from reality. But the damage was done. The resistance had been fractured. The soldiers saw Daniels vanish, and doubt spread like wildfire. If one of their own could betray them, how long before others followed? The voices pressed harder, exploiting the weakness, whispering promises tailored to each soldier's fear. Colonel Davis tried to restore order, his voice hoarse from shouting, "Hold the line! Do not break!" but his authority faltered. Ramirez slammed his fist against the wall, his frustration boiling over. "This is what happens when the rules are broken," he growled. "Every betrayal makes it stronger." John stood in the corridor, his heart heavy. He had warned Daniels, but it hadn't been enough. The betrayal was not just one man's weakness. It was proof that the resistance was fragile, vulnerable, and already cracking under pressure. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "This was the first betrayal," she said, "but it won't be the last." John tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. The resistance had been wounded, but he would not falter. He knew the voices would come for him next. And when they did, he would have to choose silence or surrender. The lab had become a prison of shadows, but John Miller soon realized the danger was no longer confined to its steel corridors. The voices, once contained within the sealed chambers, had begun to seep beyond the walls. They were spreading, reaching into the frozen wilderness outside. It started subtly. Soldiers stationed near the perimeter reported hearing whispers carried on the wind. At first, they dismissed it as exhausting or paranoia, but the whispers grew clearer, sharper, unmistakably human. "Come outside," they called. "We're waiting." The voices mimicked loved ones, comrades, even children. Each word was designed to lure them into breaking the rules. John stood guard near the outer gate when he heard it himself. The wind was still, the snow frozen, yet a voice drifted across the silence. It was his sister's voice, soft and familiar, calling his name. His heart lurched. She lived thousands of miles away in the United States, yet the sound was so real it made his chest ache. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remember the colonel's warning. Do not respond to voices. Emily Carter rushed to him, her face pale, her breath ragged. "It's outside now," she whispered. "The containment is broken. The voices are reaching beyond the lab." Her words carried dread. If the voices could spread into the wilderness, they could spread into towns, cities, and eventually the entire country. Ramirez confirmed the worst. He had intercepted a transmission from Anchorage. Civilians reporting strange whispers in the streets. Families hearing voices of relatives who weren't there. "It's moving fast," he said grimly. "If it reaches the cities, people will respond. And when they do, they'll vanish." The soldiers grew restless. Some covered their ears, others muttered prayers, but the voices pressed harder. One soldier broke, running into the snow, shouting his wife's name. The resistance chased after him, but he was gone before they reached the gate. His footprints ended abruptly, erased as though he had never existed. John's resolve hardened. The voices were intelligent, manipulative, and relentless. They weren't just haunting the lab, they were expanding their reach, testing the boundaries of reality itself. He realized the rules were no longer enough. Silence and discipline could protect them inside, but outside, the world had no defense. Emily clutched her notebook, scribbling frantically. "We need new rules," she said. "If the voices spread, people must know how to resist. If they don't, the erasure will consume everything." Her words carried urgency, but John knew the truth. Rules could only delay the inevitable. The creature was learning, adapting, and now it had found a way to infiltrate the world beyond. As night fell, the Arctic wilderness was alive with whispers. The voices called from the snow, from the wind, from the silence itself. They were everywhere, pressing against the fragile barrier between containment and collapse. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his breath shallow. The lab was no longer the battlefield. The world itself was under siege. The whispers had already reached the frozen wilderness, but now they were spreading farther, into the cities. Anchorage was the first to report anomalies. Families claimed to hear voices in their homes, calling them by name. Neighbors vanished overnight, their existence erased from memory, their records scrubbed clean. The city was unraveling, and the lab's nightmare had become a public crisis. John Miller listened as Ramirez relayed intercepted transmissions. "Anchorage is compromised," he said grimly. "Civilians are hearing voices. Some have already disappeared. The government is scrambling, but they don't understand what they're facing." His words carried the weight of inevitability. The containment had failed, and now the infection of erasure was spreading into the heart of civilization. Emily Carter clutched her notebook, her hands trembling. "This is Phase Omega," she whispered. "The notes warned about this. Once the voices reach the cities, reality itself begins to fracture." She flipped through the pages, pointing to diagrams that showed concentric circles expanding outward from the lab. Anchorage was the first circle. Beyond it lay Seattle, then Washington, then the rest of the world. John felt the dread settle deeper in his chest. The rules had been designed to protect the soldiers inside the lab, but outside, civilians had no defense. They didn't know the rules. They didn't know the danger. They would respond to the voices, and when they did, they would vanish. Reports flooded in. A mother claimed she heard her son calling from the street, though he was asleep in his bed. A man swore his late wife spoke to him from the shadows, begging him to follow. Police officers vanished during patrols, their names erased from rosters, their families forgetting they had ever existed. The city was dissolving, piece by piece. Ramirez slammed his fist against the table. "We need to act," he growled. "If Anchorage falls, the rest will follow. We have to warn them. Teach them the rules, give them a chance to resist." His voice carried urgency, but John knew the truth. Rules could only delay the inevitable. The creature was learning, adapting, and now it had found a way to infiltrate the world beyond. Colonel Davis, his authority fading, tried to rally the resistance. "We hold the lab," he insisted. "If we lose this place, the spread will accelerate." But his words rang hollow. The lab was already broken. The city connection had been made, and reality itself was unraveling. John stood in silence, his rifle heavy in his hands. He thought of Anchorage, of families forgetting their loved ones, of names vanishing from memory. He realized the battle was no longer confined to the lab. It was everywhere. The voices had breached the walls, and now the world itself was the battlefield. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "The city connection has begun," she said, "and once it spreads, there will be no going back." The spread of voices into Anchorage forced the government to act. What had once been a classified containment project buried in the Arctic was now a national crisis. Families were reporting disappearances. Police forces were losing officers mid-patrol, and entire neighborhoods were forgetting the existence of those who had vanished. Reality itself was unraveling, and Washington could no longer deny it. Agent Ramirez received direct orders from the Capitol. Emergency task forces were mobilized, communication lines flooded with reports, and a veil of secrecy was imposed. The official narrative described mass hallucinations and psychological contagion, but those inside the lab knew the truth. The creature was rewriting existence. Colonel Davis gathered the resistance in the control room. His voice was hoarse, but his words carried urgency. "The government is sending reinforcements," he announced. "Special units trained for containment, but they don't understand what they're walking into." His tone betrayed frustration. Soldiers could fight enemies they could see, but this was something different, something that erased rather than killed. Emily Carter shook her head, her notebook clutched tightly. "They'll fail," she whispered. "If they don't know the rules, they'll vanish. And when they vanish, the world will forget them. Reinforcements will only feed it." Her words carried dread, but they were true. The government's response was too late, too blind. Ramirez relayed classified directives. "They're preparing evacuation protocols for Anchorage," he said. "They want to move civilians out, isolate the city, and impose martial law. But evacuation won't matter. The voices are already spreading. You can't evacuate memory. You can't evacuate reality." His words struck the resistance with grim clarity. Reports from Anchorage grew worse. Families insisted they never had children. Schools claimed students had never enrolled. Businesses lost employees whose names no longer existed in records. The government scrambled to erase panic, but the erasure was faster than their lies. John Miller listened in silence, his rifle heavy in his hands. He realized the government's response was not about saving lives. It was about preserving control. They wanted to contain the narrative, not the creature. But reality itself was slipping through their fingers. Colonel Davis slammed his fist against the table. "We hold the lab," he growled. "If we lose this place, the spread accelerates. Reinforcements or not, we fight." His words carried defiance, but John knew the truth. The lab was already broken. The government's response was a desperate attempt to mask failure. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "They don't understand. This isn't war. This isn't science. This is collapse. And if they keep treating it like a military operation, they'll vanish too." Ramirez nodded grimly. "The government thinks it can control the narrative, but the creature is controlling reality, and reality is stronger than politics." John tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. The government's response had begun, but it was already too late. The voices were spreading, the erasures accelerating, and the fragile barrier between containment and collapse was breaking. Anchorage had become a city of whispers. Families vanished overnight. Schools lost students whose names no longer appeared in records, and businesses dissolved as employees were erased from existence. In desperation, the government ordered a mass evacuation. The plan was simple: move civilians out of the city, isolate the area, and contain the spread. But nothing about the voices was simple. John Miller listened as Ramirez relayed the orders. "They're moving people by bus, by train, even by air," he said grimly. "But the voices are already inside the evacuation routes. They're calling names, luring people away before they reach safety." His words carried the weight of inevitability. The evacuation was doomed before it began. Emily Carter clutched her notebook, her hands trembling. "You can't evacuate memory," she whispered. "You can't evacuate reality. Once the voices reach them, they'll vanish no matter where they go." Her words chilled John. The evacuation wasn't just failing, it was feeding the erasure. Reports flooded in. Entire buses disappeared mid-journey, their passengers erased from rosters, their families forgetting they had ever existed. Trains arrived empty, conductors insisting they had never carried passengers. Airplanes landed with no record of boarding, their manifests blank. The voices had infiltrated the evacuation, rewriting reality faster than the government could respond. Colonel Davis slammed his fist against the table. "We told them," he growled. "We told them reinforcements wouldn't matter. Now they're sending civilians straight into its grasp." His frustration boiled over, but his authority was fading. Soldiers looked at him blankly, some forgetting who he was. Even leaders were not immune to erasure. John stood in silence, his rifle heavy in his hands. He thought of the families boarding buses, clutching children, believing they were escaping. He imagined the voices calling to them, mimicking loved ones, luring them into shadows. The evacuation was not saving lives, it was accelerating the collapse. Ramirez's voice was grim. "Anchorage is gone," he said. "The evacuation failed. The city is dissolving piece by piece. And if we don't stop it here, Seattle will be next." His words carried urgency, but John knew the truth. Stopping it was impossible. The creature was rewriting reality itself, and no evacuation could contain that. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "This was Phase Omega," she said. "The notes warned us. Once the voices reach the cities, there's no going back." Her words echoed in John's mind, heavy with finality. The resistance watched helplessly as Anchorage vanished from maps, from records, from memory. Families outside the city insisted they had never had relatives there. Government officials denied the evacuation had ever taken place. Reality itself was erasing the evidence. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. The failed evacuation was proof that the battle was no longer about containment. It was about survival against something that could erase the very fabric of existence. And Anchorage was only the beginning. Anchorage was no longer a city. It was a battlefield of whispers and shadows. The failed evacuation had left streets empty, buses abandoned, and families erased from memory. Yet amid the collapse, a small group of soldiers, scientists, and civilians refused to surrender. They gathered in the heart of the city, determined to make one final stand. John Miller stood among them, his rifle heavy in his hands, his breath fogging in the frozen air. The voices pressed in from every direction, calling names, mimicking loved ones, promising safety. But John had learned the truth. Responding meant erasure. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay silent, even as the voices grew louder. Colonel Davis rallied the survivors, his voice hoarse but resolute. "This is it," he declared. "We hold Anchorage or we lose everything. Remember the rules. Do not respond. Do not break." His words carried defiance, but John saw the fear in his eyes. Even Davis was fading, his existence slipping as soldiers forgot who he was. Emily Carter clutched her notebook, her hands trembling. She had rewritten the rules, simplified them into desperate commands. Remember names, resist voices, hold the line. She distributed copies to the survivors, urging them to memorize every word. "If we forget," she warned, "we vanish." Ramirez coordinated defenses, positioning soldiers along barricades and rooftops. But the shadows were everywhere, moving through alleys, stretching across walls, bending light itself. Gunfire erupted, but bullets dissolved into darkness. The creature was not fighting, it was consuming. The voices grew unbearable. They called John's name with perfect clarity, mimicking his sister, his father, his fallen comrades. Each word was a blade, cutting deeper into his resolve. He repeated names in his head: Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had already been erased. Memory was his weapon, the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. The battle raged through the night. Soldiers vanished mid-stride, their screams cut short, their existence erased. Civilians clung to each other, whispering names like prayers. Emily scribbled furiously, documenting every disappearance, even as the ink faded from the page. Reality itself was unraveling, but she refused to stop writing. Colonel Davis fell during the stand, swallowed by shadows, his name erased from rosters. Some soldiers forgot him instantly, but John forced himself to remember. "Davis," he whispered, over and over, refusing to let the creature erase him completely. By dawn, Anchorage was silent. The streets were empty, the survivors few. The resistance had fought with everything they had, but the city was gone. Families outside Anchorage insisted they had never lived there. Maps blurred, records vanished, history rewrote itself. Anchorage had been erased. John stood among the ruins, his rifle lowered, his breath ragged. The last stand had failed, but he was still here. He remembered the names, he remembered the fight, and he knew one truth: the battle was not over. The creature had won Anchorage, but the world was next. Anchorage had been erased, its existence scrubbed from maps, records, and memory. But the collapse did not stop there. The voices, relentless and cunning, had already begun to seep southward. Seattle was next. John Miller listened as Ramirez relayed intercepted transmissions from Washington State. "Civilians are reporting whispers in their homes," he said grimly. "Families claim to hear relatives calling from outside. Police officers vanish mid-patrol. Hospitals are losing patients who were never admitted. Seattle is unraveling." His words carried the weight of inevitability. The infection of erasure was spreading faster than anyone could contain. Emily Carter clutched her notebook, her hands trembling. She flipped to the final pages, where warnings had been scrawled in frantic ink. Phase Omega, urban collapse. Beneath the words was a diagram showing concentric circles expanding outward from Anchorage. Seattle was the next circle, and beyond it lay the rest of the United States. "It's happening," she whispered. "The notes predicted this. Once the voices reach the cities, reality fractures." Reports confirmed her fears. Families in Seattle insisted they had never had children. Schools claimed students had never enrolled, and businesses lost employees whose names no longer existed in records. The government scrambled to impose martial law, but soldiers vanished mid-deployment, erased before they could act. John felt dread settle deeper in his chest. The rules had protected them inside the lab, but outside, civilians had no defense. They didn't know the rules. They didn't know the danger. They would respond to the voices, and when they did, they would vanish. Colonel Davis, though fading, tried to rally the resistance. "We hold the line," he growled. "If Seattle falls, the rest will follow." But his words rang hollow. Davis himself was slipping, his existence eroding as soldiers forgot his name. Even leaders were not immune. Ramirez slammed his fist against the table. "We need to warn them," he said. "We need to teach them the rules before it's too late." His voice carried urgency, but John knew the truth. Rules could only delay the inevitable. The creature was learning, adapting, and now it had found a way to infiltrate the world beyond. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. Seattle is the turning point. If it falls, the spread will accelerate. Families, cities, nations, they'll vanish, erased from existence. And no one will remember they were ever here. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. He thought of the families in Seattle, of children hearing voices in the night, of parents vanishing mid-stride. He realized the battle was no longer about containment. It was about survival against something that could erase the very fabric of reality. The voices grew louder, carried on the wind, pressing against the fragile barrier between memory and oblivion. Seattle was next, and the world was running out of time. The spread into Seattle revealed a new horror. Leaders themselves were beginning to vanish, not just physically but from memory. Authority, command, and history were dissolving. The voices were no longer targeting soldiers or civilians alone. They were erasing those who carried responsibility, those whose names anchored order. John Miller witnessed it firsthand. Colonel Davis, once the backbone of the resistance, had already faded. Soldiers stared at him blankly, forgetting his existence even as he barked orders. Now, the same fate was reaching higher. Reports from Washington confirmed that city officials were disappearing, their names erased from records, their families insisting they had never lived. Ramirez slammed a classified file onto the table, his face grim. "It's not random," he said. "It's strategic. It's targeting leaders, those who hold memory for others. If they vanish, the rest collapse faster." His words carried dread. The creature was dismantling authority, stripping away anchors that kept society intact. Emily Carter flipped through her notebook, her hands trembling. She pointed to a passage written in frantic ink. Phase Omega, leadership collapse. Once leaders are erased, resistance fractures. Her voice shook as she read. This is what we feared. Without leaders, there's no structure, no rules, only chaos. Reports confirmed the nightmare. Mayors, governors, even generals were vanishing. Their names disappeared from rosters, their portraits blurred, their families denying they had ever existed. In Seattle, the police chief was erased mid-briefing, leaving officers staring at an empty podium. In Washington, senators vanished during sessions, their seats left vacant, their records scrubbed. John felt the weight of the collapse pressing down on him. Authority was dissolving, and with it, the fragile unity of the resistance. Soldiers looked to him now, their eyes desperate, searching for someone who still existed. He realized with horror that memory itself had become leadership. Whoever remembered, whoever resisted, became the anchor. Emily whispered urgently, "We have to remember them. If we forget, they vanish completely. If we hold their names, maybe we can keep them alive." She scribbled furiously, writing names over and over, fighting against the erasure. Ramirez nodded grimly. "This is the war now. Not bullets, not barricades, memory. If leaders vanish, we become the leaders. If we forget, we lose everything." John repeated names in his head like prayers. Davis, Ramirez, Carter. He forced himself to remember, even as the voices pressed harder, whispering promises of relief if he let go. He knew forgetting was surrender. The resistance gathered in silence, each member clutching names, repeating them aloud, anchoring reality with memory. But the erasure was relentless. Leaders were fading faster than they could be remembered. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. The forgotten leaders were proof that authority was no longer safe. The creature was dismantling the very structure of society. And now, the burden of leadership fell on those who refused to forget. Seattle's collapse revealed the true battlefield, memory itself. Guns, barricades, and soldiers meant nothing against an enemy that erased existence. The voices had learned to exploit weakness, but now they were waging war on the very concept of remembrance. John Miller felt it in his bones. Every time someone vanished, the world tried to forget them. Families denied their existence, records dissolved, photographs blurred. The resistance fought not with weapons, but with names. Memory became their shield, their last fragile defense against oblivion. Emily Carter led the charge. Her notebook was filled with names, written over and over, each stroke of ink an act of defiance. "If we remember, they live," she whispered. "If we forget, they vanish completely." She distributed copies to survivors, urging them to repeat names aloud, to anchor reality with words. Ramirez coordinated the effort, transforming patrols into rituals of remembrance. Soldiers marched through corridors chanting names, their voices echoing against steel walls. It was not discipline, it was survival. "This is the memory war," Ramirez declared. "We fight by refusing to forget." But the voices pressed harder. They whispered promises of relief, tempting survivors to let go. "Forget them," they hissed. "Forget, and the pain will end." Some soldiers faltered, their memories slipping, their names fading. Each loss weakened the resistance, each surrender feeding the erasure. John clung to his memories like lifelines. He repeated names in his head: Harris, Daniels, Davis, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had already been erased. He knew forgetting was surrender, and surrender meant annihilation. His mind became a battlefield, every thought a weapon against the voices. The war spread beyond the lab. Civilians in Seattle gathered in churches, schools, and homes, chanting names of loved ones, fighting against the erasure. Families wrote names on walls, carved them into wood, etched them into stone. Memory became rebellion, a desperate attempt to hold reality together. Yet the creature adapted. It targeted leaders, erasing those who carried memory for others. Teachers vanished, priests dissolved, commanders faded. The resistance struggled to keep names alive, but the erasure was relentless. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "This is not just survival. This is war against forgetting. If we lose memory, we lose everything." Her words carried truth. The memory war was not fought with bullets. It was fought with remembrance, with defiance against oblivion. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. He realized the creature's greatest weapon was not shadows or voices. It was erasure. And their greatest defense was memory. As long as they remembered, they resisted. As long as they resisted, they lived. The memory war had begun, and it would decide the fate of reality itself. Seattle had become the proving ground for the memory war, but the city was already unraveling. The voices had infiltrated homes, schools, hospitals, and streets. Families forgot their children, teachers forgot their students, and leaders vanished mid-speech. The collapse was no longer a possibility. It was happening in real time. John Miller stood at the edge of the city, watching as chaos consumed the skyline. The lights flickered across skyscrapers, but the streets below were empty, erased of life. Soldiers patrolled intersections, but their numbers dwindled with every passing hour. Each time a voice called, someone responded, and another existence dissolved. Emily Carter clutched her notebook, her hands trembling as she documented the collapse. "It's accelerating," she whispered. "The erasure is spreading faster than Anchorage. Seattle is larger, more connected. Every disappearance ripples outward, rewriting records, memories, and history." Her words carried dread, but John knew they were true. Ramirez relayed reports from the government. "Entire neighborhoods are gone," he said grimly. "Families insist they never lived there. Maps are changing, records dissolving. Seattle is vanishing piece by piece." His voice carried frustration, but also resignation. The government's response had failed, and now the city itself was dissolving. The resistance fought desperately. Soldiers reinforced barricades. Civilians gathered in churches and schools, chanting names to resist the erasure. But the voices pressed harder, louder, more insistent. They mimicked loved ones, promising safety, begging for recognition. Each response was surrender. Each surrender, another erasure. John repeated names in his head like prayers: Davis, Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had already been erased. He knew memory was their only weapon, but even that was slipping. The voices were relentless, gnawing at the edges of thought, tempting him to forget. Colonel Davis was already gone, erased in Anchorage. Now Seattle's leaders followed. The mayor vanished mid-broadcast. The police chief dissolved during a briefing. Senators faded from existence. Authority collapsed, leaving chaos in its wake. The city had no anchors, no structure, no defense. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "This is phase Omega. The notes warned us. Once the cities fall, the spread becomes unstoppable." Her words carried finality, but John refused to surrender. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. The collapse reached its peak at dawn. Entire districts vanished, their names erased from maps, their existence denied by those outside the city. Families in other states insisted they had never known anyone in Seattle. The city was dissolving not just physically, but conceptually. Reality itself was rewriting. John stood among the ruins, his breath ragged, his mind racing. Seattle was gone, erased from memory, history, and existence. But he was still here. He remembered the names, he remembered the fight, and he knew one truth: the collapse was spreading. Seattle was not the end, it was only the beginning. Seattle's collapse was not the end, it was the beginning of something far larger. The voices had breached containment, spread through Anchorage, consumed Seattle, and now they were reaching across oceans. The fracture was no longer local, it was global. John Miller listened as Ramirez relayed intercepted transmissions from Europe, Asia, and South America. "It's everywhere," he said grimly. "London reports families forgetting entire neighborhoods. Tokyo claims students vanish mid-class, erased from records. Sao Paulo insists hospitals are losing patients who were never admitted. The fracture has gone worldwide." His words carried the weight of inevitability. Emily Carter clutched her notebook, her hands trembling. She flipped to the final pages, where frantic warnings had been scrawled. Phase Omega, global collapse. Beneath the words was a diagram showing concentric circles expanding outward until they covered the entire planet. "This is it," she whispered. "The notes predicted this. Once the fracture becomes global, reality itself begins to dissolve." Reports confirmed her fears. Governments scrambled to impose martial law, but leaders vanished mid-speech, erased from memory. Families denied their own children, cities disappeared from maps, nations dissolved into silence. The world was unraveling piece by piece. John felt dread settle deeper in his chest. The rules had protected them inside the lab, but outside, civilians had no defense. They didn't know the rules, they didn't know the danger. They responded to the voices, and when they did, they vanished. Colonel Davis was already gone, erased in Anchorage. Now presidents, prime ministers, and generals followed. Authority collapsed, leaving chaos in its wake. The fracture was dismantling leadership, stripping away anchors that kept society intact. Ramirez slammed his fist against the table. "This is the memory war on a global scale," he growled. "We fight by refusing to forget. If we lose memory, we lose everything." His voice carried urgency, but John knew the truth. Memory alone could not hold back the tide. The fracture was too vast, too relentless. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "We have to remember names. We have to resist. If we forget, the world vanishes completely." She scribbled furiously, writing names over and over, fighting against the erasure. But the ink faded, the paper dissolved, reality itself erasing the evidence. John repeated names in his head like prayers: Davis, Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had already been erased. He knew forgetting was surrender, and surrender meant annihilation. His mind became a battlefield, every thought a weapon against oblivion. The fracture spread faster than they could resist. Cities dissolved, nations vanished, history rewrote itself. The world was collapsing, not through war or disaster, but through erasure. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. The global fracture had begun, and it would decide the fate of reality itself. The collapse of Seattle forced the survivors to scatter. Streets were empty, families erased, and leaders forgotten. Yet amid the chaos, a fragile spark of defiance remained. Those who refused to surrender their memories gathered in secret, forming what became known as the Resistance Underground. John Miller descended into the tunnels beneath the city, his rifle heavy in his hands, his breath echoing against concrete walls. The voices were weaker here, muffled by layers of steel and stone. It was not safety, but it was sanctuary. Survivors huddled together, whispering names like prayers, anchoring themselves to reality. Emily Carter led the effort, her notebook filled with names and rules. She distributed copies to the survivors, urging them to memorize every word. "If we forget," she warned, "we vanish. If we remember, we resist." Her voice carried conviction, and for the first time since the collapse, John saw hope in her eyes. Ramirez coordinated defenses, transforming abandoned subway stations into strongholds. Generators hummed faintly, powering dim lights. Soldiers reinforced barricades, while civilians carved names into walls, refusing to let memory slip away. "This is the underground," Ramirez declared. "We fight here, in silence and shadow. We fight by remembering." The voices pressed harder, seeping into tunnels, whispering promises of relief. They mimicked loved ones, begging survivors to respond. But the underground held firm. They repeated names aloud, their voices echoing through corridors, defying the erasure. Memory became their weapon, their shield against oblivion. John stood guard at the entrance, his mind a battlefield. He repeated names in his head: Davis, Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had already been erased. He knew forgetting was surrender, and surrender meant annihilation. His resolve hardened with every whisper. The underground grew stronger. Survivors taught children to chant names, to resist voices, to hold memory like armor. Families etched names into stone, carved them into wood, painted them across walls. Each act of remembrance was defiance, each word a strike against the creature. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "We may not win," she admitted, "but if we resist, if we hold the line, maybe we can slow it. Maybe we can keep reality intact." Her words carried hope, fragile but real. Ramirez nodded grimly. "This is the memory war underground. We fight not with bullets, but with remembrance. If we forget, we lose everything." John tightened his grip on his rifle, his breath steady. The underground was fragile, but it was defiant. They were no longer just survivors. They were guardians of memory, anchors of reality. And though the voices pressed closer, though the shadows grew darker, they stood together. The resistance underground had formed, and it would decide whether humanity endured or vanished into silence. The underground had given survivors a fragile sanctuary, but even there, the voices found new ways to infiltrate. They no longer came only as soldiers, leaders, or loved ones. They came as children. John Miller first noticed it during a night patrol. The tunnels were silent, the dim lights flickering, when he heard laughter echoing faintly through the corridor. It was soft, innocent, unmistakably the sound of children playing. His chest tightened. He hadn't heard such laughter since before Anchorage fell. For a moment, he wanted to believe it was real. Emily Carter rushed to him, her notebook clutched tightly. "Don't listen," she warned. "It's not them. It's learning. It knows children are harder to ignore." Her voice trembled, but her eyes carried certainty. The creature had adapted again, weaponizing innocence. Soon, the underground was filled with whispers. Children's voices called from the shadows, begging for help, crying for parents, laughing in the dark. Survivors clutched their ears, tears streaming down their faces. Some broke, running toward the sound, desperate to save what they thought were real children. Each one vanished, erased before they reached the source. Ramirez slammed his fist against the wall, his frustration boiling over. "It's targeting our instincts," he growled. "We're wired to protect children. Now it's using that against us." His words carried truth. The voices had found their most devastating weapon, compassion. John felt the weight of temptation pressing down on him. The whispers grew louder, calling his name, mimicking the voice of his niece. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to remember the rules. Do not respond. Do not break. But the sound of her laughter gnawed at his resolve. Emily scribbled furiously in her notebook, documenting the new phase. "Whispering children," she wrote. "Phase Omega adaptation. Targets empathy. Exploits compassion. Response equals erasure." Her hand shook as she wrote, but she refused to stop. Memory was their only defense, and documentation was their anchor. The resistance fought back with rituals of remembrance. Survivors gathered in circles, chanting names aloud, drowning out the whispers with defiance. Families etched names of lost children into walls, refusing to let them vanish completely. The underground became a fortress of memory, but the voices pressed harder, relentless in their assault. John repeated names in his head like prayers: Davis, Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had already been erased. He knew forgetting was surrender, and surrender meant annihilation. His mind became a battlefield, every thought a weapon against the whispers. Yet the laughter persisted, echoing through tunnels, mocking their resistance. The whispering children were proof that the creature was evolving, adapting to exploit humanity's deepest instincts. Compassion had become vulnerability, and survival demanded silence. John tightened his grip on his rifle, his breath steady. The underground was fragile, but it was defiant. They would resist, even against the voices of children. The memory war had entered its cruelest phase, and the whispering children were its sharpest blade. The collapse of Seattle had shown that cities could be erased, but the next phase was even more devastating. History itself began to vanish. It was no longer just people, leaders, or places. Entire timelines were dissolving, rewritten by the creature's presence. John Miller noticed it first when he tried to recall Anchorage. He remembered the battle, the failed evacuation, the last stand. But when he checked the maps, Anchorage no longer existed. Records denied it had ever been built. Families outside Alaska insisted they had never heard of such a city. History itself was erasing the evidence. Emily Carter clutched her notebook, her hands trembling. She flipped through pages filled with frantic notes, but even the ink was fading. "It's rewriting the past," she whispered. "Not just people, not just places, events. If history vanishes, there will be nothing left to anchor reality." Her words carried dread, but John knew they were true. Ramirez relayed reports from across the world. "Wars are disappearing from records," he said grimly. "Leaders erased from textbooks. Families forgetting revolutions, victories, even tragedies. It's dismantling memory on a global scale." His voice carried frustration, but also resignation. The creature was not just consuming the present, it was devouring the past. John felt the weight of collapse pressing down on him. He repeated names in his head like prayers: Davis, Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had already been erased. But now, even names from history were fading. Presidents, generals, inventors, artists, all dissolving into silence. The resistance underground fought desperately to preserve memory. Survivors carved names into stone, etched events into walls, painted timelines across tunnels. Emily documented every detail she could, scribbling furiously even as the ink dissolved. "If we forget history," she warned, "we lose ourselves. We lose the meaning of survival." But the voices pressed harder. They whispered promises of relief, tempting survivors to let go of the burden of memory. "Forget the wars," they hissed. "Forget the pain. Forget, and the silence will be peace." Some faltered, surrendering to the temptation. Each surrender erased another piece of history. John stood guard in the tunnels, his rifle steady, his mind racing. He realized the memory war was no longer about individuals. It was about civilization itself. If history vanished, humanity would dissolve into nothingness. There would be no record, no legacy, no existence. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "This is Phase Omega's final stage, the vanishing histories. Once the past is gone, the future cannot exist." Her words carried finality, but John refused to surrender. He tightened his grip on his rifle, his resolve hardening. The histories were vanishing, but he remembered. He remembered Anchorage, Seattle, Davis, Daniels, Ramirez. He remembered the fight. And as long as he remembered, reality still had a chance. The vanishing of histories left humanity desperate for anchors. Memories were fading, records dissolving, and even the past itself was being rewritten. In the midst of this collapse, whispers spread of a hidden sanctuary, a place where fragments of truth were preserved. Survivors called it the Last Archive. John Miller first heard of it from Ramirez, who carried a classified file marked with fading ink. "There's a vault beneath the old university," he explained. "Scientists stored records there, names, events, histories. If it still exists, it may be the only defense we have left." His voice carried urgency, but also doubt. Nothing had survived the erasure for long. Emily Carter's eyes lit with fragile hope. She clutched her notebook, its pages already dissolving, and whispered, "If the archive is real, it could anchor reality. If we protect it, maybe we can resist the collapse." Her words carried conviction, and John felt a spark of determination ignite within him. The resistance underground mobilized. Soldiers and civilians descended into forgotten tunnels, guided by fading maps and half-remembered directions. The journey was perilous. Voices echoed through the corridors, mimicking children, leaders, and loved ones. Shadows pressed closer, bending light, testing their resolve. But they pressed on, repeating names aloud, refusing to forget. At last they found it. A vault sealed with steel doors, buried beneath layers of concrete. Inside were shelves of books, reels of film, hard drives, and handwritten journals. The archive was imperfect. Many records had already faded, but fragments remained. Names carved into stone, events etched into paper, histories preserved against oblivion. Emily wept as she touched the shelves. "It's real," she whispered. "The Last Archive, proof that memory can survive." She began cataloging frantically, copying names into her notebook, anchoring them with every stroke of ink. Ramirez organized defenses, positioning soldiers at the vault's entrance. "This is our last stand," he declared. "If the archive falls, reality falls with it." His words carried grim truth. The archive was not just a sanctuary, it was humanity's final hope. John stood guard, his rifle steady, his mind racing. He repeated names in his head: Davis, Harris, Daniels, Carter, Ramirez, forcing himself to remember those who had already been erased. He knew the archive was fragile, but it was defiant. As long as it existed, reality still had a chance. The voices pressed harder, whispering promises of relief, tempting survivors to abandon the vault. "Forget," they hissed. "Forget, and the silence will be peace." But the resistance held firm, chanting names aloud, drowning out the whispers with defiance. The Last Archive became more than a vault. It became a symbol of resistance, a beacon of memory in a collapsing world. For John, it was proof that humanity could fight back, not with weapons, but with remembrance. The Last Archive had given the resistance a fragile anchor, but the creature was not finished. What came next was